Thank you.
It's good to see you, Sam.
My apologies. Yes, it's very good to see you as well. My apologies about that whole mess. I get reminded of my own lecturer who always had trouble with technology.
Yeah, it happens when it shouldn't have, but it's okay. We're very happy to have you here. Our team was very, very excited about this webinar. We have followed your work for several months right now since we became members of SDSN. We're working on some things to kind of like push the participation of Latin America in SDSN youth. And I wanted to take the opportunity to invite you and talk to the team and other partners who are joining us about what you guys are doing. For me, it's very, very special to have you to talk to the team, because we met over half a decade ago in Canada when we were both doing Model United Nations. So it's very, very cool to see how much you have grown and been able to mobilize so many young people across the globe, especially with SDGs and sustainable development. So for me, it's a very, very special moment, and of course for my team and for other partners that are joining us. So before we discuss a little bit about the questions that I sent you before, and then we're going to share with our partners here, I wanted to read a little bit about your bio so people who don't know you get to know you a little bit more. Well, Sam is the founder and global coordinator of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network in its youth division. This is an organization which empowers youth globally to create sustainable solutions. As a global coordinator, Sam has mobilized thousands of young people globally to engage with the UN SDGs, which you all know about, and has helped initiate several global programs, including Local Pathways. Perhaps you're going to talk a little bit about that, the Global Schools Program, and the Youth Solutions Report. Sam is also a project officer with the Monash Sustainable Development Institute in Melbourne, Australia. He's actually very early in the morning over there. I guess it should be around 9:45. And ever since he has been a student, he has been very, very active. We have a lot of Model UN nerds in our team, so it's very good to have someone who did many conferences to be able to have such an impact globally. He coordinated the Harvard World Model United Nations in Melbourne, Australia, which brought 2,000 students from 85 countries to Melbourne in Australia. I remember in Canada when you were pushing to bring Harvard World Month to Australia, and you did it, and congratulations for that. And I heard from other friends that it was very successful. So during that time as well, he won a Harvard World Month Diplomacy Award. I remember correctly how you were so creative and smart while debating, and that eventually took you to meet some of the greatest United Nations Sustainable Development nerds, which took you as far as you are now, and we're so proud of you. So we prepared like 4 questions that we'd like you to share to our audience, and those are questions that I'm going to ask you directly that will lead to discussion, and then we're going to open the floor for our team members to ask you some questions. Especially, we'll be very curious to know a little bit about your background, how you end up leading such a great network of individuals and professionals across the globe. And welcome. Thank you so much to be with us. I know you have a very tight schedule. He's soon going to the United Nations General Assembly and many other important events. So we look forward to see you grow even more. So I have a really interesting question that I want to hear your insights about it, which is, why are the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, so important for young people?
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Karol. It's an absolute pleasure being here, and I can't believe it's been almost half a decade. So it's wonderful to see that you're also in positions of leadership and leading My World Mexico and the UN SDG Action Campaign. It's absolutely wonderful. Now, before I answer the question, why are the SDGs important for young people? I think one thing to understand is what are the SDGs and what is sustainable development. I think that is the critical issue. Now, everyone thinks of sustainable development in the non-UN circles as just environmental issues or tree hugging and environmentalism, and just a lot of misconceptions about it. But actually, it's quite simple. Sustainable development is the kind of development that is supposed to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own goals. It's as simple as that. It's a system. It's a principle of commitment. And it's about the long-term ability of generations to continue doing what they're doing without destroying their lives, without having problems or facing significant challenges that really threaten their livelihoods into the end of the century and the next century. So it's a system. It's a principle. And as young people, we have a direct connection to this, because what happens with us, our livelihoods, will depend on the success of the Sustainable Development Movement. Now, world leaders came together and put the SDGs and created them and negotiated them and basically approved of them. And basically, as I said, our livelihoods will depend on it. So this is why they're so important to young people, but just people across the planet. Remember, the motto of the SDGs is leave no one behind. And that is a serious and big commitment that we are facing as a global society, that we must be committed to leaving no one behind. And that takes serious steps. And as a part of this, if we are to be committed to leaving no one behind, we've got more than 3.5 billion people on the planet that are under the age of 30. So this is why it's so important to us. The sheer numbers, half the planet's population is under the age of 30. And if we are serious about addressing these goals, then we must involve young people, and we must bring them into the conversation. We must have them as a part of discussions. We must make sure that they are part of the implementation process, the review, the monitoring, whatever involves the implementation of these goals and the execution of plans to put these goals into action, then we need to be brought on board.
Thank you, Sam, for that answer. Some of the things that maybe we like to talk about is that the participation of young people in the consultations that were led across the globe to define the SDGs. For example, My World, it's an initiative by the United Nations SDG Action Campaign, which was born out of a consultation, a very simple consultation that was very successful, and it was able to reach 10 million people. But those 10 million people were able to be reached because of the participation of groups of young people from civil society. In the case of Mexico, out of those 10 million participations, 2 took place in our country. And I was a direct witness of that. In the case of my state, Jalisco, we were able to collect almost 400,000. And that was possible thanks to 500 young people that gather, built a team, and we're able to mobilize the survey. So at the end of the day, at least in the case of my country, we want to defend the priorities that we asked directly to the population. We went to different towns, we went to different municipalities and different communities and asked people what they wanted to see in development, which it's very different to what happened with the MDGs. And you know that, of course, the MDGs were not consulted, were not open to the public. It was very, very hard for people to connect with the MDGs because of this. And even now, we know that the SDGs are more popular now after 2 years of their adoption than the MDGs were in 15 years, right? So I see that like we have to defend what the priorities that we set there. So I wanted to ask you, in your experience, I mean, you're literally on the other side of the globe. How did you feel connected with the young people? What were they telling you when the consultations of the SDGs took place? What were their priorities? How is it what are you looking at differences? If you're looking at differences in terms of priorities in places like Mexico or maybe Europe that you've been there a couple of times, or in places like Australia, what are you think that are the issues that connect the most?
Well, I completely wanted to echo those sentiments, which is that the Sustainable Development Goals were not just put, because I mean, it's easy to look at the Sustainable Development Goals and in their official capacity, they're called the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And you look at the goals and you assume, oh, well, this was probably the UN putting together a series of goals, and it's for, utopian future that we'll never have, and it's so far from reality, etc., etc. And it's very easy to just assume that it was just put together by a number of experts and bureaucrats at the United Nations level and then given to member states to sign. But that's actually not what happened. It was the most inclusive UN process ever. It was 3 years of negotiations and consultations. I mean, it was massive. You had basically businesses involved. You had many NGOs involved. You had young people involved. You had all governments virtually having a say in the negotiations. It was a very comprehensive process that took years to achieve. There were all these major groups representing various sectors across society were involved. And in particular, the average citizen had a role. That's very important. The average global citizen had a role. And that's in large part thanks to the work of My World, which basically rolled out this massive global survey, rolled it across the planet, and had people vote. What are your priorities? This is wonderful to see. And if you look at the SDGs, they're not perfect because they were negotiated, and that could be a weakness, but it's also a strength. It's a strength because it means that all governments feel some sort of ownership on some of the goals, and this is very important. Now, when we were doing the My World consultations and we talked to various sectors and to, in particular, young people, I think it was very clear that, of course, education was very important, but from the discussions, from what we had, was this understanding that climate change must be one of the main goals, must sit at the top, conflict and also inequality. And in fact, these are the very three things that the MDGs lacked. They didn't address income inequality, they didn't address climate change, and they didn't address conflict. And we know these things can reverse years of development if we don't address them. Now, for example, with conflict, I just ask you to look at the case of Syria. Billions of dollars, years of development, all reversed in the space of 2 or 3 years. Life expectancy went from I think it was 71 years to 51 years. 4 out of every Syrian is now living in poverty. The damage to infrastructure and the economy is in the billions. And so you can see what sort of impact conflict can have on development. And so you cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals without looking at these issues. And the same goes with climate change. One disaster, one natural disaster, one storm, desertification, all these various issues, drought, all of these can cause serious problems and can reverse years of development and aid. So there is no way we can have the SDGs without seriously addressing these issues. And that's what a lot of the discussions were coming to when we had at that time. And I think across the planet, doesn't matter where you look, you will start to see that climate change is always at the top of the priority lists, addressing conflict, but also education. We know the very important role education has played. I don't have to go into and justify it. You could start to see this really, these cluster of ideas that all of them were sort of centered around the same thing. But more importantly, I think one discussion that really stood out for me when I was talking to people back then, when you actually went to the depth of the discussion, you actually realized that they would say that a lot of these issues are interrelated. Factor about the SDGs that is often overlooked: the interlinkages, the impact of one goal on another. The MDGs didn't have a systematic approach to development and sustainable development, but the SDGs do. The targets are interrelated. Impact in one area leads to impact in another. Disaster in one area leads to disaster in another. And there are so many factors that connect them all. And this is a very important thing to address, is that you can work on one goal, but you must recognize how it impacts the others. And this is something that's often forgotten. So when it comes to the work of the negotiations, I remember that goals such as climate change and the conflict goal, the peace and justice, and the inequality goal, these were all very controversial goals. They were forced in there, essentially. Last minute. And it was very tough negotiating this. And it wasn't a marketing campaign. It was tough negotiations when instead of having 10 goals, you have 17 goals. And instead of having 100 targets, you have 169 targets. Very imperfect numbers. And when you talk to people and who are not in the world of development, sometimes they see that. Again, the SDGs are not perfect, but they set out our priorities. They set benchmarks for policymakers, for business leaders, for NGOs, to be backed up with data and monitoring. And they help mobilize people around a simple set of universal goals, our global priorities. And that was really the discussions that I was having at the time. And it was tough, but I think we ended up with a set of goals that are worth fighting for.
Thank you, Sam, for your answer. I was thinking about the moment when we adopted. Someone's mute them. When we adopted the agenda 2 years ago in September, we were at the General Assembly Hall. I remember that was actually the last time that I saw you in person. And if you can recall correctly, the atmosphere there was very enthusiastic. Everyone was so excited. The General Assembly Hall was packed. Malala was there. Each and every one of us, the young people that were there, looking from the balcony at the General Assembly, telling world leaders we want this to be achieved. And many of the partners that were there in the General Assembly Hall, such as you and many others, were people that were working in the consultations and the negotiations, the NGO major groups, a major group on children and youth, etc. Many partners that were involved in the discussion. And at least to me, it's very frustrating to see that 2 years from that day, we get a lot of governments that are pushing the agenda the other way. We have extreme nationalism. We are looking at countries that are opting to turn into bilateral negotiations, or just kind of like focusing on their economic interests. We have a U.S. administration that yesterday, for example, in the case of Mexico, is dismissing almost 1 million people that migrated to the United States when they were only children, and they're going to be kicked out, they're going to be deported, and these are hardworking individuals around in the United States. And that's just for migration, which is one of the issues that's kind of like seen in the SDGs, as well as others such as climate change. You were at COP when this was negotiated 2 years ago as well. So a lot of people, when I discuss these issues, when I go to different settings, when I'm with them, especially on the ground, discussing these issues, they say, yes, we can get involved at the very local level. We can start mechanisms to implement the agenda. But at the end of the day, we're going to look at leaders, especially our leaders, who are going to turn the other way around, who are not going to look at our interests. So is it worth it to be involved in the discussion? Is it worth it to still have that energy to achieve the SDGs? Is it going to be another lost promise from the UN, just as many others have been? I'm trying to kind of like keep my hopes up that we will be able to achieve it. But at the end of the day, we're getting this sense of especially from some countries, and Mexico's having elections next year is going to be very hard for us as well, especially with everything that's going on in the United States that now directly affect us, especially because perhaps Trump wants to withdraw NAFTA. We don't know what's going to happen. Canada is also making weird comments of our foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of like relates to the question that I had prepared, which is why we must get involved in the implementation of the SDGs. And with all of this background, with everything that is going on with foreign policy and countries looking at nationalism as something that's coming back, what can we do? How can we get involved? You have had experience with foreign policy as well. You've been part of this global discussions as well. Maybe the question will be, is it worth it? And if it's worth it, how are you going to do it? What creative ways from your experience can we start doing in order to get involved and kind of like have the attention from our governments?
I'm good. You can hear me now? Yes? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Yep, good. Yeah, so it's very easy at the moment to look around at the news, at what's been happening around the world, especially in the United States, and feel very disappointed. It's very easy to see what's been happening with international negotiations and feel very disappointed. And you should. But having said that, one thing to bear in mind is that we don't have the luxury of not doing things. We're almost over the carbon budget. We have conflicts that are going on. And these disappointments are the more reason for why we need to rely more on ourselves. We need to rely more on the people, on the work that wonderful NGOs are doing, on the work that wonderful local governments are doing, and things that are happening locally, entrepreneurs, the activists. I don't draw my inspiration from Donald Trump and his policies. I draw my inspiration from you, your colleagues, other young people around the world, NGO leaders, young entrepreneurs who are committed to the SDGs. I'm just coming back from the Unleash Innovation Labs in Copenhagen, and I had the wonderful pleasure of working with a group of approximately 100 or so young people from across the planet. And when I saw them and when I work with them, I know that we stand a chance. And even though it's very easy to be disappointed by this, I think there is plenty of inspiration out there for us to look into. We have this final opportunity. And what we need to do is mobilize the communities, mobilize the young people within those communities to become entrepreneurs, to come up with innovations, human-centered innovation, to keep governments accountable. And let's not forget, the governments were the ones who picked this. They committed to these goals. And there are plenty of governments that are taking very serious steps, but they're not newsworthy. They're not negative. They're not what causes a crisis. And in fact, on the eve that Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there were a group of state legislators, local government leaders, businesses, entrepreneurs, big companies, NGOs, who all put out their statements saying the US, and these were all from the United States. They said, yes, the US may be pulling out, the government, the federal government and Donald Trump. Well, we're in, and we're all the way in. And we will maintain our position, and we will fight even harder now. And this is very important, because a lot of people look at the situation of Donald Trump and feel very angry and very, very disappointed. But I also look at it as an opportunity for us to lead the way. And I think when it comes to our planet and our future, there is no compromise. We must be persistent in what we believe in and push for it. And this is very important. I remember I asked there was a certain keynote speaker from the Gates Foundation, and I said, it's very easy for people not to listen to you, especially when you're young. You're just not taken seriously. What do you do? He said, carry on. Be persistent. Do not take no for an answer. Because this is not about other people. This is about you and your planet. And you have every right to fight for it. And there are many who do. And you can join forces with them. If there are a few who want to be left back in the previous century and be beholden to dirty politics and money, let them. But you have a role and you can make a difference. And I sincerely believe that. Looking at some of the solutions from the Youth Solutions report that my colleagues have put together, I mean, they're absolutely wonderful. They're bringing energy to thousands of homes. They're addressing healthcare across the planet. They're reducing poverty. They're providing education to vulnerable children. They are addressing climate change. They are they're trying to ensure that inequality is stemmed at the critical level. And these are where I draw my inspirations from. These are where I get very, very enthusiastic about. And I think we all have a role to look at the SDGs, this open, inclusive process, and say, governments must keep to their promise. We must keep them accountable. And it's easy to say, but I think we have a serious role in mobilizing around the goals to keep the governments on their toes and to draw examples from what some of the other more progressive governments have done, who have set up commissions, who have made sure they have SDG working groups that are going across mapping the various contributions that the entire government is making, and many, many, many other very interesting initiatives. Getting the universities on board, making sure that the research that they do is in line with the SDGs. But I think what I would do as a young person who is interested in creating my work, in creating my own work, or having my own business, or having my own NGO, I would go to the SDG index and find out where my country ranks, what are the problems that my country faces. There you can easily tell what are the indicators. Where are we falling behind in this country? Where are we falling behind in this community, in this city? Find out what those are. And whatever I design will be an attempt to address those. And you might fail the first time. The first 2, 3 times might be an attempt. But the 4th time, 5th time, you might come through and make a huge impact. So this persistence and constant effort is what I think pays off. And there are lots of barriers, I don't deny that. There are lots and lots and lots of barriers. There are lots of biases, particularly against young women in various countries. But I think we can spend time in trying to grapple with those, or we can just do what we're good at, which is mobilizing people, using technology, although me not so well, and really coming up with these creative solutions that we need. Let's not forget, 3 billion, more than 3.5 billion of us, tech savvy, well educated. There's plenty to be excited about.
Thank you, Sam. And one of the things that I also wanted to address is, and it was related to the previous question, is what are the creative solutions that we're having across the globe in order to not only achieve the SDGs, but to also tackle other problems. Like you said, and this is something that we definitely need to mention, is the fact that not all of the issues were covered by the SDGs. I remember back in December 2014, when we got the draft from all the discussions that took place with civil society, scientists, private sector. It was a way more ambitious agenda. And that agenda went through 5 intergovernmental negotiations, which means countries discuss the issues that we were willing to commit and those that they were not willing to commit. Some of those issues included gender identity, included a real and a little bit more of enforcement with climate change and other things that were in the discussion led by civil society and the private sector. So what we did, I mean, we knew that governments, because of those intergovernmental negotiations, were not willing to commit to some of the things that were initially in the discussion. So we had to make sure that with our actions through other networks, we will be able to at least, even though they were not within the SDG scope, have these issues in the gender identity, something that completely affects our country. And Mexico is not as bad as other places where even people with other gender identity are punished, or they're taken to jail, or other things that are going on. And well, Mexico, it's affected by gender inequality as well. We have a country with a high rate of femicide. We have a lot of domestic violence taking place, a lot of women that do not get involved in politics. I talk about this because we're having elections next year, and we want to see how women are going to react to this, or if they want to get involved. So those are the many issues that we have, but I also wanted you to share a little bit with our team, why was SDSN Youth born, what role took in the discussion, what SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a network that existed before the adoption of the SDGs, kind of like took the initiative in focusing on young people, and what was the story there, because I think it's a story worth telling to partners across the globe, to kind of like a good practice for them to kind of lead the way and start their own thing, especially at the local level, because sometimes we focus a lot and we get really excited about what's going on in international politics. But then you go back home, especially within municipalities or at the very, very local level, and our officials, our deputies have no idea what the SDGs are. Sometimes they're working on those issues, but they're not kind of like connecting it to what's going on at the international level. And there's a text that I always mention, which is by David Hume, by the University of Manchester, when he wrote the story about the MDGs and how they were adopted. And they call the MDGs back then the world's biggest promise. And that's kind of like a huge name tag for the MDGs. And I would say that the SDGs are in fact the world's biggest promise because of the way that they were adopted. So how is SDSN Youth helping achieve that world's biggest promise? How it was created? What are some of the projects that you guys are leading in order to include people, especially at the local level? I mean, My World Mexico is involved with SDSN Youth, especially in teaching the SDGs to people, because it might seem like everyone talks about it, but then when you go to the ground and when you talk with civil society, especially people living in very rural communities or even within the cities, they have no idea what's going on. And it's even more concerning that when we talk to our politicians, because we do kind of, we have a lot of interaction with them, especially because compared to other countries, Mexico has positioned the 2030 agenda as a national priority. It's part of our Mexican presidency. We have a national committee that kind of like gathers 26 federal agencies, and they're working a lot on that, and it's there. But when you go back to the local level, our officials have no idea what we're talking about. So with that little bit of background, I would love if you could share the story about SDSN Youth, how you got involved in the process, how a young student from Melbourne was able to meet the Pope a few years back, to have been there for the adoption of the SDGs. And I would really, really love for you to kind of like inspire our colleagues with that story.
Well, thank you very much, Karol. And there's quite a few things to unpack there. But just on the story of the SDSN, so the SDSN was launched by the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2012 after the Rio conference, with the intention of mobilizing global experts, and in particular universities, to assist with the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also their implementation after they were adopted. So that, and as a part of that, the SDSN's focus was and is on research, so mapping and identifying gaps and pathways towards the SDGs and climate decarbonization. So, for example, we had the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which is a project which identifies what pathways we need to take to 2050 to make sure that we reach zero net carbon emissions in the 16 biggest industrial countries in the world, and including Mexico. The other one is the SDG Index, where it ranks countries according to the SDGs and identifies where they're missing gaps, how they're working, and it's basically like a report card. And these things are very important because they address the gaps in the research. They address where governments need to put their priorities and really need to focus on. So these are some of the work SDSN does in terms of research. There are also a number of solution initiatives. So how do we use this research but actually have an impact on the ground? So supporting and giving expertise to various governments, to various civil society organizations, companies, etc. Really, how do we get this information and transform it into real solutions, transformative solutions, not band-aid ones, transformative, things that actually rethink the whole system. And of course, education and the SDGs. If we want local authorities, as you said, to be aware of the SDGs, if we want students, professors, if we want business leaders, industry leaders, NGO leaders, all these guys to be aware. We need education in the SDGs. We need courses. We need information that these people can use to better understand the goals, their purpose, and how they fit into various sectors. And this is why we created the SDG Academy. It's essentially an online course where you just learn more about the various thematic areas of the SDG: macroeconomics and sustainable development, climate change, sustainable development, health and sustainable development, and it really tries to go through each goal. And so these were the priorities of the SDSN, with 30 centers around the world and multiple networks and 700 universities that are part of it, to make sure that all of this research is supported by expertise. So within this network, why then, or how did we get to an SDSN youth? Well, it was simple, really, the justification. So when Professor, in 2014, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who was the director of the SDSN, visited Melbourne, and we had a workshop with young people about how we could really work towards the SDGs. And he was very impressed with this workshop, and he wanted a global version of this workshop, which was really focused on youth solutions for the SDGs, and he wanted that to happen across the planet. This was wonderful, because then we got the opportunity, a rare opportunity, and I really thank him for having this open mind and this commitment to youth empowerment and this understanding that if we want to achieve this, we will need young people on board. He said, okay, put together a proposal and bring it to New York in September and present it to the Leadership Council at SDSN. And we did. And despite the tough questions, they were on board. They supported it. Because it came from really three understandings: that more than half the planet's population is under the age of 30. If we're going to achieve these goals, We'll need those numbers on our side. The one was about the numbers game. Second, the SDGs are a transformative agenda, and they need creative out-of-box solutions. And we need fresh ideas. And maybe these young people can come in and add those fresh ideas. And thirdly, it's the energy, the idealism. While the SDGs could be more ambitious than they are now, they're still pretty ambitious. And if we want to implement an ambitious agenda, we're going to need idealism and energy. I think where you start to get real impact is when you have numbers, the idealism, energy, but also the creative and outside the box ideas that usually come from younger people. And when you combine that with the finance, the influence, connections, and power of older generations and the expertise, when you mix these, that's when you start to get real impact. I think it's an intergenerational effort. It's not just about young people or older people. It's about this pragmatic and thought through effort to try and bring creativity to very, very complex ideas. And that is really what SDSN Youth was born of. And we have three core areas that we focus on. Educate young people about the SDGs. Connect groups of young people who are dedicated and are working on one or more areas of the SDGs. And thirdly, support and scale SDG solutions. Why educate? Well, it's pretty simple. As I said before, if we're going to work with young people, we need them to be aware of the SDGs. But not just that. Educate is not just about awareness. Being aware of a problem doesn't solve it. To be aware, but also to see what the relevance are to their lives. And then thirdly, how they can actually make an impact. That's, I think, the concept of educate. So we want to answer three questions, really, with our work in education. What are the goals? Why should I care? How does it relate to me? Why should I care? And thirdly, yes, I know what the goals are. I know why I should care. But what do I do about them? What is the next step? And if it's not easy and accessible and I can't really identify those pathways, then we're going to lose this battle. So when we educate, we really need to address those three. And I'm very, very happy to see that we have a campaign, specifically a global campaign called the Know Your Goals, which is really focused on that. We just try to support local organizations to work within their communities, whether it's on campus, whether it's within the community center, whether it's in the town hall, it doesn't matter where it is, whether it's online, digital, it doesn't matter. But really to answer those three questions. What are the goals? Why us as this particular community should care? How does it relate to us? And thirdly, what can we do? And I think this localization exercise of getting local communities to discuss such issues is very important. It's what's going to create the ownership. We hear all the time, ownership, ownership. In the UN halls, I hear it all the time, ownership, ownership, ownership. That's very important. But how do you create that ownership? And I think like this, allowing local organizations to have the discussions themselves, and then connecting those discussions at a global platform. That's really what the Know Your Goals campaign is about. And I'm very happy to see that My World is taking part in it. Thanks to your leadership. And we really wanted to see these results. 2 years later, what's happening? What are the discussions at the local level? Where are we at? It's this progress chart that we need to look into. We're also, as a part of this, we shouldn't just focus on our generation, which are young professionals, university students, 18 and above, but also younger. So part of our mandate within Educate is about how do we educate children as well? they need to be aware of the goals. In fact, they will be facing the same issues that we will. Part of the same set of generations that will be dealing with the impacts of climate change and all the various other challenges that exist. So we created also the Global Program, which is really about how do we educate resources from UNESCO, UNICEF, our world's largest lesson, and how do we really distribute this to the local level and get it to be used. And we open applications for young people to join and help achieve this. And I think we had something like 3,000 applications, which just shows the interest that people have in doing these things, in really making a contribution, really having an impact, really educating others about this. So these are really the two really interesting. And I think the third one, which kind of we can mention the education realm, and which is where a lot of our efforts focus, is 2030. So it's essentially, how do we use the arts? How do we use inspiration? How do we use imagination to inspire change? And this is often in high-level bureaucratic discussions at the UN. These are things that are often forgotten. We must remember that people will always care about how you make them feel, and I think the art is this tool to stimulate the imagination and let us see and reimagine the future. It's a very powerful tool that my colleague Isabel was leading. So in terms of education, those are the initiatives which a lot of our things focus on. In terms of the second component, which is connect, it's, if we want to mobilize quickly, if we want to share experiences, if we want to have best practices, and if we want to really have a global community that is committed to this, then we need to connect more using these digital tools, just as we are now. This is a wonderful example of it. So this is why SDSN Youth is committed to bringing local organizations, whether they're student association, youth organizations, youth-focused organizations, it doesn't matter. If their work is on the SDGs and they're committed to it, then we try to connect and bring them all together so they can share ideas, share practices, but also mobilize quickly. When things happen, we can mobilize quickly. We can create campaigns like Know Your Goals and really try to have an impact and learn from one another. I think that's a really big strength of SDSN Youth, is the global nature of it and the 500 plus organizations from around the world that are connected to us. It allows us to learn from them. It allows us to connect them and help them and really identify and scale their work. And in terms of support and solutions, which is the action-oriented stuff, we have two really interesting and cool projects. One is called the Youth Solutions Report, which is led by my wonderful colleague Dario Piselli. And really the focus is, here are 50 solutions that young people are doing around the world, which are absolutely wonderful. And if we were to scale some of these, we would actually have a real impact. It's about identifying these and really use them as inspiration for other entrepreneurs. Use them as inspiration and as stories for others, but also to help these guys get expertise, get mentorship, get visibility, and potentially funding. These are how these conversations happen, through these connections. So that's the wonderful work that my colleague is doing. And then in terms of the other very interesting project that you mentioned earlier, it's called the Local Pathways Fellowship. And this is led by my wonderful colleagues Anastasia Kostomarova and Dan Chan. And really the idea is they selected 60 young people from 50 different cities around the world, or 52 different cities around the world. And they're working together on creating local solutions. So it's an innovation process at the community and city level. And these stories are what matters. The impact they have in these communities are what matters, because this is going to inspire others, because we're going to use this as an official input into the high-level political forum process and other UN processes, including the World Urban Forum and others. So it's about creating impact and using that story to inspire others. And I think a lot of this is thanks to the wonderful leadership of my colleagues who are leading these processes at the global level with these projects, but also at the local level. We have 20 local networks and network coordinators who are organizing events, mobilizing young people within their cities and countries and regions, doing wonderful projects from SDSN South Asia to SDSN Australia Pacific, Amazonia, Spain, Greece. All of these guys are doing Great Lakes, others who are doing this wonderful work and doing these very creative actions on the ground. And it's just great to see. And all of this came about from this commitment to young people. All I did was convince a group of very influential individuals that young people could have an impact and provide a system for it. The rest of the work is done by others, and I only take credit for it. But what I've been really inspired by is their work. I think that's what's really keeping me going, seeing what they're able to produce with such little resources and such little time. And one other thing that we've really found absolutely wonderful is the support that the SDSN Secretariat has been giving us in really making these solutions come to life. In particular, Professor Sachs, who's always been a big supporter. And all of this somehow ended up at the Vatican. And that's where we met Pope Francis, and it was a truly wonderful occasion. Although a bit packed because everyone was trying to take photos with him, but it was wonderful to see him and speak to him and shake his hand and to thank him for the moral leadership that he's been leading around the world and really inspiring people and saying that these problems are not about religion, race. This affects us all, and we all have a responsibility to act on them. That's wonderful to see. We need more leaders like him.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that answer. And I think it's worth noting that similar to the work that we do with My World, we have a lot of young people, all of them connected, going through kind of like an understanding of why are the SDGs important, but also to make this appropriation phase in which they know that they have a role in that, no matter where they are, no matter if it's a small village or if it's a big company, because we also have organizations joining our team, which is now 200 volunteers from across the country and 65 organizations, as big as companies and making lots of profit, as well as very, very small organizations, all of them playing a very important role in one or more SDGs. A lot of environmentalists, I have to say, that makes me really proud. And I relate a lot to what's going on with SDSN Youth because we do have limited resources. Some of the people that we have in the team are in very remote areas. We have volunteers from other parts of the globe that are also joining us in kind of like establishing these mechanisms to lead development efforts at the national level. So it's very similar the way that we work in both initiatives, even though it's supported by the UN, is not fully funded by the UN. A lot of the things that the volunteers do, and that happens with SDSNU, they do it because they want to do it. And they do it through a very professional and creative way. We have all kinds of volunteers from, and I thought about Isabel because we have Eric, for example, who's in the state of Coahuila, who's only 14, and he also plays the piano. So he presents the SDGs through concerts, for example. Or we have other people doing massive beach cleanups or leading very interesting projects related to SDG 14, because some of the SDGs, you probably know this as well, are more popular than others. And those SDGs that are not as popular also need our attention. So it's very, very interesting to look at the work that you guys have done with very limited resources and with the challenges that distance brings. And and that to us, to learn from you, to be part of SDSN Youth as a member organization as well, is very, very important. And one thing that you mentioned that is also very important for us is to connect. I always share different opportunities with the team. They have the right to also go to those international political spaces and kind of like show governments what they're doing in the ground, which is very valuable and sometimes even better than what the governments are doing, unfortunately. So, and that same happens with the organizations that are part of our network. So, thank you so much for everything that you talked about. We have a like 3 or 4 questions that I try to gather just to make one big question, or maybe 2 big questions, and at the personal level, and that's one of the questions that I send you. What motivates you to be involved in all of these things? I mean, you talk about what you see, the good examples that you have, that you get from young people, all the different products, all the different initiatives, all the different creative solutions. That, I guess, keeps you inspired. But what led to Sam to go to Model UN conferences, to invite Jeffrey Sachs to Melbourne? What was the life-changing moment for you that keeps you hooked to this? Because it's kind of like an addiction. You try to get rid of it. Sometimes you're frustrated or stressed. Sometimes you need to get funds. For example, in Mexico, we're organizing a big conference and we're trying to get the funds and the money and all of that. And at the end of the day, you still do it because you want to see a better world. So I want to know what keeps Sam involved in the SDGs process at the personal level. And there's a very interesting question that I would like you to talk about. We're in a privileged place. We have traveled the world. We have met people from various backgrounds. We have knowledge. We're capable of getting in touch with UN officials, and they will reply to us because they know about the work that we're doing. They know about, but we have to work hard for that. It's not free. It's not just because. It didn't just happen. We had to work I'm sorry for the word, but we had to work our asses up in order to get the attention from UN top officials and even the UN Secretary General, blah, blah, blah. But are we entitled to talk about the people who are in very vulnerable communities? Are the SDGs democratic? Are we entitled to talk about poverty, to talk about climate change, to talk on behalf of many others? Is that a responsibility? Is that something that we should do? And I think this question from one of our volunteers that she sent me on a private message called Khalil, it's, do we have the right to do this, to talk on behalf of many others? And then that for me, it's kind of like a very philosophical and theoretical development issue. And sometimes when I go to communities, because part of the job that I'm doing with my World Mexico is to travel to very impoverished or very forgotten areas within the country, some of them with very, very difficult access. So sometimes I wonder, am I the spokesperson for them? Do I have the responsibility, or I do it because I want to, or is it because it keeps me inspired, or because it gives me a level of satisfaction? I think that the 2 questions kind of like relate to each other, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as Sam and as global coordinator of SDSN Youth. What do you think about that?
So on the first question, what keeps me motivated, and what makes me committed to the SDGs? Well, firstly, everything that I've ever cared about are within the goals. The issues that I care about, the issues that I've been passionate about, are within those. Also, their approach, which is that they are these set of very interconnected goals, makes it very exciting, because it means that you're looking at society in a systematic way and not just piecemeal, or solve one issue there, one adjustment there, one impact there, but you look at it as a system. And the word transformation is used over and over to describe the SDGs. And transformation in development language means revolutionary, completely outside the box. And that's why I care so much about them. But that answers how I care about them, I suppose. But in terms of what motivates me to keep going and care about these issues in the first place, is that I guess 2 things. When I was growing up, I spent 4 years as a refugee in Pakistan, and there I witnessed conflict, killings, assassinations, extreme poverty. The inequality was just mind-boggling. And some of the things I saw there really made me change my perspective on life. It had a severe and deep impact on me in many ways. And I come from a family of political activists and human rights activists. And so there was always that potential that my parents had taught me to care about people, to care about the issues of the world. So I always looked at it. When I went there and I saw it with real eyes, it had a massive impact on me. And it made me disappointed. It made me sad. It made me think that the world is a horrific place. And then when we eventually traveled to Australia and became citizens of this country, I compared that life in Australia with the life that the average young person or average child had in Pakistan. And I was still seeing that some of the wonderful work that their student movement was doing, some of the wonderful work that even my parents, when they were young and all the difficulties they faced, they still were committed to these causes. And I thought, well, I live in this wonderful country, Australia, and I have these wonderful privileges now. With the things that I've seen, there is no way that I can go back, ignore, and just think about myself. I want to do things to help people. I want to try and solve some of these problems. And you never can solve them all, of course not. But the idea, as you said, it's very addictive, of being able to contribute and try to help. And you strive for that impact because it makes you feel good. Because it's what drives you. And I've had the amazing privilege of seeing people in this space that truly inspire me. When I see the work that you do, and many others, that's an inspiration for me. That keeps me going. It's addictive. Who doesn't love the kind of work that is trying to have an impact or having an impact, but at the same time gets inspired every day? There are many frustrations. I completely agree. There are many challenges. But overall, it's something I love and I wouldn't change it for the world. But you again raise another very important question, which is, really goes to that philosophical question. It's about creating an impact, or wanting to create an impact and creating an impact, and making sure that what you do doesn't actually create more problems, but actually solves them, doesn't duplicate efforts, doesn't undermine the voices of others. And this is a problem that goes across the planet in many development circles, and it's one that needs to be addressed. So do we have the right to talk on behalf of some communities? I personally don't think that we have a right to speak on behalf of those communities, representing those communities. But we have a right to reflect their voice. We're not being heard from, we're not being heard of. What we can do is assist them. Put them in touch with the channels, or get them through the channels where they can have their voices heard, or giving them the tools that they need. The focus shouldn't be just on how we want to do it, but also should be on what is it that they want? What is it that would benefit them? So of course, going to various communities and speaking to them is a wonderful example, but we need more than that. We need the localization of these goals. We need the localizations of these conversations, which means that we need them to discuss amongst themselves as well, these various communities, on why should they care? How is this relevant to them? And how could it help them make a difference? let's not forget that the issues in the SDGs are nothing new. But the tool is just an opportunity for us to look at these questions and try to address them. So this is a very difficult question, and I wish I could unpack it with a straight answer. But from my perspective, it's a huge problem that needs to be addressed. And all we can do is provide support, not necessarily speak for them. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Thank you, Sam. I always admire that. When I remember that I look at your video from the opening speech at Harvard World, that you talk about your background, and I always love to see how far someone who has struggled so much can go, and you're a perfect example of that, and that's why you have the respect of myself and the members of my team, because it's a matter of consciousness, a matter of a transformative process that can eventually lead to take action. We have a country that struggles with many issues. We have a country that struggles with violence, inequality. Just last week, the National Evaluation Council launched a study in which we still have 9 million people in the country under extreme poverty, and people who don't have anything to eat, and the top 25% that we call here still manage the income that belongs to many other millions. So it's very difficult for us. Sometimes we try to look at the bright side, but that gets overshadowed by the negative aspects. But I think that if we talk to other people, if we connect with others, even with the language barrier, if we find the right partners, we can eventually be a bigger force. And I think that what we're doing here with both of our networks is a perfect example of that. And it's inspiring others, and at least it's getting people's attentions and curiosity. Just from what I share, and I'll give you an example, we share the call that we launched on Know Your Goals. And we got a lot of emails. We got a lot of emails from partners from Latin America, and we got the attention of our presidency. So they want to know what we're doing with Know Your Goals, and perhaps that could lead to a bigger partnership, and that's something very helpful for us. And for them to be able to see that even with a simple retweet, even with a simple share, that we have networks across the globe who are paying attention to what we're doing, and vice versa, it gets the attention from our national authorities. And I think that we can do a lot if we work together, if we continue to have these discussions, if people can approach you. I mean, it's not a matter of Sam being a top official or a higher authority that it's unreachable. I think it's the other way around. And it's important for people to know that you're a simple young man in Australia and a simple Mexican woman in Mexico, and our volunteers who are also connected in Mexico and other parts of the world are change makers, are as important as us, are as valuable as us. We're all equal, and I think that it's a matter of bravery. It's a matter of saying, I want to lead change, and I think we're doing that. Thank you so much for your time. We had several other questions, but I think that eventually we can have another webinar and to go a little bit into detail about SDSN. I know you have a very tight schedule. That's why we're letting you go early. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm personally super proud of everything you have achieved. I know we'll eventually see you in many other places, being even bigger and being as bright and as smart as you are. And then we're so proud of you. Thank you so much for joining us. We will continue to be engaged with SDSN youth activities, and I think that we have many interested people and many other partners from Latin America that will eventually also join SDSN youth. We already have a lot of questions of how can they join and what can we do together, and please count on My World Mexico as a partner and their volunteers in the network. They're very hardworking and creative people that are leading solutions, the solutions that you guys are looking at, and I think we're gonna do great things together. And again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Karol, and it's been an absolute inspiration, and thank you for all your amazing and hard work. It's been wonderful, and it's just great to see the leadership that you and your team are leading in Latin America and Mexico. And if anyone wants to ask me things, if they want to ever speak to me, I'm quite accessible via LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is. I'll be more than happy to answer more questions, and I look forward to more and more partnerships and collaborations and discussions such as this. I think it not only stimulates and gets people involved in the important conversations, but also it helps me think about very important issues and reflect once in a while. So that is really helpful. Thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sam. Have a great day in Australia.
No worries. Take care. Buenas noches.